Welcome to another exciting episode of Iokua Hates Everything. This will be the first of a three-part series that covers the 3D Castlevanias. I'll be discussing what they did right, what they did wrong, and what I think should be kept and tossed out the window for future 3D Castlevanias, specifically Lords of Shadow coming out in the fall. So, first on the docket is Castlevania 64 and Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, both released in 1999 for the Nintendo 64. In the second episode, I'll be covering Lament of Innocence for the PS2 and Curse of Darkness for the PS2 and Xbox. And in the final episode, I'll cover where the series should go from here, what I think they should do, what I think they should incorporate from all the other 2D Castlevanias in the history of the series, and why I think the Castlevania series hasn't been given the justice it deserves in 3D. It's an absolute crime the way the series has been treated, and personally, I don't think that Lord of Shadows is the right thing to do. It's a step in the right direction, but it looks too much like a God of War clone to me. Alright, we'll start with the gameplay, specifically the combat. As you can see, it's pretty typical action fare, although the action genre was definitely not the right way to go when designing the 3D Castlevanias. This much is made obvious by the clumsy camera and floaty controls. 3D game design wasn't evolved to the extent that the design team was looking for while developing Castlevania 64. Unfortunately, the first true advancement came out shortly before the release of Castlevania 64 in the form of Ocarina of Time. We all know what Ocarina of Time did for the industry. We don't really need to cover that aside from the camera. That was pretty much the big dun-dun-dun-dun moment for that game. Now, the clumsy combat aside, the game presents itself as a bare-bones attempt to take the classic 2D Castlevania format and do it in 3D. Now, with 4 characters to choose from, all with distinct playstyles and a couple unique levels for each of them, plenty of sub-weapons, and 3 primary weapon strength levels to play with, it's pretty easy to see that Konami's heart was in the right place with Castlevania 64 and with Legacy of Darkness. The same can't be said for the design, though. To complement the loose, floaty camera, there is a lot of platforming, and I really mean that. There's a lot of platforming, and it's not bad, but the controls can make it harder. It's easier to overshoot things. It's easy to undershoot things. The clumsy camera also really does not help at times. But once you get past those issues, it's pretty typical Castlevania platforming. There's plenty of pitfalls, bottomless pits, spikes, and all those typical things you find in a Castlevania game. But, as I said, that is a huge weakness because the camera really does at times ruin the game. Now, I'm going to show you an example of that and of the flaws with the general design. Now, as you can see, there are monsters attacking me while I'm on a relatively small platform with very little movement space. I almost fell off there. And as you can probably tell, the camera wobbles when I move around, and the jumping is a little floaty, which makes the platforming harder than it should be. This took me about 3 attempts to actually pull off without getting knocked off by a fishman, or doing the wrong jump because I moved the control stick a little bit to the wrong direction, and I went flying off towards the screen. It's a little clumsy right there. When it all comes down to it, the only thing that the design team pulled off properly is the balance of the levels. There is no one level that relies solely on combat or solely on platforming or solely on puzzle solving. It's really the only moment and the only aspect of Castlevania 64 and Castlevania Legacy of Darkness that really shines. The games have great balance. The levels, while not designed extremely well, they do well in those areas. Now, right here, I'm going to show you the weakest part of the presentation. 3 different characters with identical cutscenes. Identical! They barely fix them at all. You have levels with bright garish colors, which don't make for very good viewing while playing. You have effects that are so large and clumsy that it makes the gameplay difficult to deal with. The presentation actually gets in the way of the game. It's hard to deal with the depth perception in some parts. You think things are closer than they are. You think things they aren't. You can't see where you're going to jump. The camera gets in the way. It's just... the presentation should always complement a game, and there are a lot of things in Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness where the gameplay... it's adequate for what you're doing, but the presentation itself, dude, how garish the colors are and how clumsy the effects are, it just makes it harder to deal with things. I mean, I don't know, it's hard to describe without experiencing it, but it just doesn't function very well on a fundamental level, and the balance between gameplay and presentation, which should be present in every single game, which they should have known about, regardless of whether this was their first shot at a 3D Castlevania, it shouldn't have gotten in the way. They should have known how to balance the two, because they've been balancing games for 15, 16 years from Konami by the point this game was released. They should have known what they were doing, but they didn't. Another massive weakness in the presentation is recycling. As I showed you that recycled cutscene, there are recycled levels for the Legacy of Darkness characters. There's only, I think, 3 or 4 original levels in that game. It makes for a very stale and boring experience at times. And it really weakens the advancements that were made in Legacy of Darkness, however few they were. Now, when we boil it all down to that final aspect of what upcoming 3D Castlevanias need to learn from Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness, it's the balance. It's the one thing Castlevania 64 did properly. The balance between platforming and combat and puzzle solving is solid throughout Castlevania 64, but it's not present at all in Lament of Innocence or Curse of Darkness. It's just the biggest flaw with the future Castlevanias that I can see, and from the ones that came after Castlevania 64, is that they ditch major classic gameplay elements, and that weakens what makes them a Castlevania. Now, we'll cover that in the next one, where I will absolutely tear into Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness. But what you need to take home from this one is the Castlevania games, especially Lord of Shadows, need balance.